It was a mixture. So one thing was I'd always loved the story of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, where the second wife is overshadowed by the dead first wife. And I was intrigued by the idea of doing a kind of comic take on that, with the first wife being alive and well and quite irritating, but still a very dominant presence. And so I thought that had comic potential. And then also I'm a second wife myself, and so I've experienced that feeling of kind of insecurity of thinking, what have I got to offer? Am I not just the second wife, but am I second fiddle? Am I kind of less good in some way? And so there's that insecurity, which is quite interesting from a novel's point of view. And the third thing was that it partly also gave me a setup of writing about a step family, as the heroine is a stepmom to the husband's kids from his first marriage. And that's quite another sort of hurdle she has to overcome. And I think you also get a sense of what it's like from their point of view, that actually it's quite difficult to have another adult suddenly pitched into your life. I haven't been a stepmother myself, but I was a stepchild growing up, and it's quite difficult. Yeah, the village is loosely based on a village in Kent called Wye, which is where I used to live. And it's just a very pretty Kentish village. And the advantage of setting something in a village is it gives you lots of potential for coincidence. It gives you quite an enclosed world, potentially slightly claustrophobic. There's a downside of that friendliness of people knowing each other, is that you can also feel that your flaws are very much on display. So it was quite a good prism for the novel to make things feel quite confined, and the heroine feels that every time she just goes in to buy half a dozen eggs, that there's the first wife sort of popping up again, and I quite like that idea. Sometimes you draw quite tiny things from people around you. Usually they're things that have got echoes and reflections in yourself. The fact that you're able to see something in someone else. Like in my previous novel, Growing Up for Beginners, there's a character who's a 74-year-old academic, male academic, and a friend of mine said he is just freakishly like her dad, and who I've never met. But in fact, of course, he's also a bit like me. It's just, I'm not 74, I'm not a man, and I'm not an academic. But the kind of pedantry, a certain kind of being a bit perfectionist in a slightly annoying way, that is really quite like me on a bad day. And I think that's true of all your characters, and even more so of the ones that you don't like when you first write them. I've had characters where I think, oh, she's so a bit obsessional or something. And then you start to think more about them. You realise that they're more complex than that, and there's a reason why they're like that. And that's the thing that interests me, that digging down into why a character is a certain way. I used to work in women's magazines, and then I was a non-fiction editor specialising in gardening books. That's left me with a really great love of plants, which is lovely. But it was quite what would now be called, I think, a toxic environment. It was a very, very unhappy place. The upside of that is that it prompted me to get on and leave and start writing. So looking back, I think I should be quite grateful for it. I wish I did. I wish I were more. I wish I could, just write a synopsis and then write the book according to the synopsis. But I don't. I work in a much more chaotic way. I write bits of the book as they come to me. I have a sort of, broadly speaking, an idea of certainly of the themes and the basic story and who the main characters are, which I develop near the beginning. But sometimes when you start writing, you realise, oh, like with The Second-Hand Husband, I thought, well, Natalie, the main character, she's not an only child. Does she have a brother or sister? I realised she had a sister. And initially that person is just, I know she needs a sister. And then you start to think, actually, what would that person be like? Two people who are brought up together, but there's a bit of an age difference. How are they different? How does their personality differ? And I find that just incredibly interesting, really. So most of the other writers I know write straight to laptop. I do start with a pen, and particularly when I'm doing character notes, I would always do that with pen. And if I'm writing a new scene, and I'm not quite sure where it's going, I write with a pen, and there's some really good reasons for that. One is it's quite playful. It just feels like I'm just scribbling, I'm making notes, no one's judging me. My handwriting is quite awful, so I mean, I can barely read it, never mind anyone else, but it's quite free, and it feels like there's a very direct line from brain to arm to pen, that it's flowing. When you write on a computer, you've got your nice plain document there. It looks quite neat. And the downside of neatness is it can look finished. It can look better than it is. Whereas if you write a scene by hand, when you put it on the computer, you change it immediately, you're going to start improving it. So it's already going to sharpen up a lot just in that transition, because then you're reading it back with a fresh eye. So I do, but often when I start a scene by hand, when I put it on the computer, I might then carry on with it. So it would be very much a mixture. Unfortunately, yes, it is. And that's one of the things I find very difficult is I think I'm quite good at rewriting, but you've got to have something to rewrite. So this is the horror of the blank page. I do sometimes get a bit stuck. And then I sometimes revisit passages or sections or indeed entire chapters where I know I've drafted them, but they're a bit of a mess. Like the order is a bit out of sync, or something happens, there's a kind of glitch in the middle, or the timing doesn't make sense. And so sometimes that's quite a good way of unsticking yourself, is to go back and rewrite it. But I rewrite a lot, really just a vast amount. So although each book will have been through at least 4 complete drafts by the time it's published, within that some chapters might be at 10th draft, but the overall thing will only be at 4th. Yeah, well, Wilkie Collins was very interesting on this, because he felt that they were absolutely inextricably linked, and that good characters grew out of strong story, and that strong story grew out of good characters. And broadly speaking, I think that's true. But I used to read a lot of thrillers, and sometimes they've got very gripping storylines, but the characters are quite two-dimensional. And I would say my work is definitely character-led rather than story-led. But I do think if you get the characters right, the story does grow out of who they are, so it makes sense. It doesn't feel like you've just slapped a story on a group of passive people, but that's to do with their backgrounds and insecurities and yearnings and fears and all the things that make us human, and that the story develops out of that and how they interact. I think often not consciously, but then when you go back and look, I can see that I look borderline obsessed with loss, and more importantly, the fear of loss. And when I talk about loss, I don't just mean, bereavement or grief. I quite often write about, there's often a subtext in my books about fear of loneliness, about people being in a relationship that's not good for them, but they can't let it go, either because they're frightened of being alone, though not consciously, or because their sense of self and identity is rooted in the relationship. Like in Growing Up for Beginners, my 5th novel, the heroine, Eleanor, is in a marriage that's clearly not a lot of fun, but she's been married a long time, and she doesn't really have a very strong sense of herself as a separate person, but as sort of part of this unit, even though she's not happy. And I think people do sometimes cling to what's familiar because it's known, even if it's actually not good for them at all. And that interests me a lot. And that's pretty much a flat no. I think writing with a moral is a very bad idea, and it wouldn't suit me. But I think sometimes you can have a message and not know what it is. I think writing polemic when it's fiction is not great, because it's going to weigh your story down. I think you want to tell a story that's interesting and entertaining, and that people can become completely absorbed in. That's what I like, is when people say, oh, I was reading and it was getting later and later and my eyelids were drooping. I was just like, one more page. That's the nicest thing you can hear. But sometimes you go back and you think, okay, yes, there was a sort of subtext here about, learning to be true to yourself, or learning what will make you happy. It's usually something like that. Yes, obsessive, really. When I was a kid, I was a real comics nut, to the extent that I would literally prop my comic up on the inside of my piano music, memorize the piano piece, So I could play the piano piece without the music and read the comic at the same time, which now seems quite a difficult thing to do. Or I would have my comic on my lap under the table at supper, which my dad really didn't like. He felt it was very antisocial. And I would just become completely absorbed. Yes, I've had phases like in the pandemic where I just found it very difficult to concentrate and I read much less. But now I'm back reading and I absolutely love reading. I've got a huge list of writers I love. Most of them are, I mean, if we're setting aside historical writers like Austen and Dickens, who we just assume, that all writers love, which I do. I love Anne Tyler. I think I've read all of her books. Elizabeth Strout was a wonderful discovery a few years ago. She's an incredible writer. Carol Shields, getting a bit of a North American women theme going. John Irving. Lisa Evans is a wonderful British writer. Kate Atkinson's fantastic, very intelligent, funny. So a lot, really. And I read a lot more novels than non-fiction. I probably read about 4 or 5 novels for every non-fiction work I read, I think. I think partly it's because I'm a slow writer, or relatively slow writer, and when I work, I do become very, very sort of immersed in the book. And by the time I've written it and rewritten it and rewritten and redrafted it, and then it's gone to an editor and come back and gone to a proofreader and come back, the whole process is quite long. It's not quite that I'm sick of them, but I'm very happy to sort of wave my characters on their merry way, to them to have their own journey, and for me to turn to the next thing. And when you start a new book, there is very much this feeling that your characters are waiting in the wings, wanting you to tell a story. But it's actually very exciting working on something new. And but that said, I do sometimes imagine my old characters from previous books. I don't write about them, but I do imagine them. I think about them. I think, oh, what would she be doing now? Yeah, she'd be, this age, and I think she'd have kids. And, I mean, you don't know, and it's irrelevant anyway, but it's quite a nice exercise to let your mind roam.